says no gluten, but they don't normally have gluten. It's like a sugar packet that says no salt. Oh, hi. Ladies and gentlemen, and whatever else you got, I'm Layman Pascal, and you're on the Integral Stage Author Series. This is part two of an interview with Dr. Rabbi Mark Gaffney and esoteric developmental scholar Zach Stein as emissaries and scribes for international man of mystery, anthro-ontologist, and neo-theologian David J. Temple about his book, First Principles and First Values, 42 Propositions on Cosmoerotic Humanism, the Meta-Crisis, and the World to Come. Last time we talked about the writing of the book, its historical provenance, and its general thrust. So today, if I can get my pretty little head around it, we'll dive into some of the more specific elements in this dense and promising volume. Hi, guys.
Hey, good to see you, Layman. Zach, always good, brother.
So, in 1989, there was this TV series on Fox that I used to watch with my mom. It was called Alien Nation. It was kind of like a proxy for racism. Humanoid aliens had escaped slavery. They'd crashed on Earth, and then they'd gotten jobs. And now a human cop and his alien partner were solving crimes that always had to do with systemic anti-alien prejudice. So that's Alien Nation. What I'd like to do today is use the concept of alienation as a way to probe the underlying insight structures of this book. So David Temple has 13 forms of alienation as a way of articulating a swath of general attributes of the global intimacy disorder, which interweave and reinforce each other into a single gross, stagnant mass that characterizes the pathology of today and tomorrow. Now, I would guess that most people have a vague sense of the word alienation as maybe relating to Marxist notions of the separation of workers from the determination of what they work on and how profits are distributed, or to a psychoanalytic notion of how people have an underlying discontentment about living in modern civilization and the way it gives rise to neuroses. But obviously you guys are using the word alienation fairly broadly. So what is it in a general flexible sense that is applicable to all 13 of these issues?
Well, maybe we'll do like this, right? And I mean, Zach could have jumped in as well, but maybe I'm going to go a step before, and then maybe then Zach will talk a little bit about alienation. But let me just kind of wind it back a step, if I can, Brother Layman, which is in the context of what Zach and I talked about as the second shock of existence in an article that we wrote in 2011, right? As we, steered the think tank, right, which we had founded with our dear friend Ken Wilber as the Center for World Spirituality, trying to articulate a world spirituality, which we now call a universal grammar of value, a shared story of value. But that was the initiating impulse. There was a gradual. I was in Europe giving a series of talks on unique self in response to, kind of the Club of Rome limits of growth kind of, realizations that were really then seeping into culture in a new way. There was a kind of a new awareness, and a number of us were kind of stepping out of techno-optimism in a certain sense, a kind of euphoric, right, and into that. And so Zach and I talked and wrote about the second shock of existence, the first shock of existence being the realization of the dawn of history, of the death of humanity, not as a biological, but an existential realization, which then presses the human being into life, and the death of the human being. And we began to understand the second shock of existence as the death of humanity, or the death of our humanity. Now, in that context, we began, to kind of look for, underlying, right, root causes. Right around that time, I began a series of conversations with Barbara Marx Hubbard, right? And it's Barbara about 2013. And Barbara she dedicated 25 years of her life to the win-lose metrics, right, as a kind of root cause. And she shared a lot of that with me, with Daniel Schmachtenberger, right? We had a big, win-lose conversation, which then led to kind of the Taleb, fragile, complicated versus complex systems kind of things. And our friend Daniel's done a lot of work in taking that couple of steps further in really important ways. Barbara was, Barbara joined the think tank, and then, we had this very deep in 2013, 14, because I don't want to skip over the global intimacy disorder. I don't want to go that, right? Because this is the core of it. So at that time, I was then emerging out of this sense of reality as Eros, which I had written about kind of in 2000. You and I talked about that work and this realization of the intimate universe. And we formulated kind of an intimacy equation, an interior science, an early version of an intimacy equation that actually understands reality as intimacy and kind of talks about, for example, the proton, and her two lovers, right? The neutron at the beginning, and then 380,000 years later, the electron, right, kind of joins, right? And you've got this great love affair, and how that Eros kind of, that intimacy, and a very particular understanding of intimacy as kind of shared identity, in the context of mutualities of recognition, mutualities of feeling, pathos, mutualities of value, and mutualities of purpose, right, actually defines the universe. So that sense of the intimate universe, right, that sense of being in this field, this participatory field of Eros and intimacy is, right, the authentic state, right, of being alive, right? To be alienated, right, is to be unable to access the inherent nature of that state. So what we then realized was, right, very clearly, that actually underlying what Barbara, and ourselves and Daniel had talked about as generator functions of what we call the second law of existence or existential risk, underlying that was what we then called a global intimacy disorder. And I was working very closely then with kind of, Mark Schwartz and people like, that world, that gang, Dick Schwartz also does now IFS and, Van der Kolk, that gang, right? So we're talking a lot about intimacy and intimacy disorders. And there was a realization that there's a global intimacy disorder that actually underlies existential risk. And that global intimacy disorder itself is based on an alienation from value. So that's how we got there. I just want to so the global intimacy disorder itself is a terminus technicus that we articulated to try and understand that underlying the generator functions of existential risk, right, is, right, this root cause. And if you think kind of, House, Hugh Laurie, the English actor in that show, right, diagnosis is everything here, right? We can't move to heal the intimacy disorder without actually realizing it's there. And if we talk only in mechanical structural infrastructure terms or even social structure terms, we can't actually approach it. So that's just because you tenderly and beautifully quickly threw in the term global intimacy disorder. So it's worth kind of understanding that the premise is reality is Eros. Eros means something very particular, right? It's an intimate universe, right? We live in an intimate universe. The intimate universe lives in us. And that takes us into the conversation on alienation. So that helps for context, Zach. So turning to you, brother.
Yeah, I mean, it is a very useful context. In one sense, because of the kind of philosophical language we've created around intimacy and Eros, we can define alienation very specifically, because we can say it is not those it is not those things, right? It is not intimacy. It is the absence of intimacy, and therefore the presence of this other thing, this alienation. And the Marxist definition isn't too far, because Marx was talking about value in a different way. And when you think about a theory of value in contemporary terms and theories of value that have changed the world, you're looking at Marxism square in the eye. Exchange value versus use value, and then the alienation of the laborer from the actual value of what they are producing. That is a kind of like materialist shade of what we're talking about that can apply across all domains of your life. So you can be alienated not just from the value of your labor, you can be alienated from the field of value itself. Now, I'd argue that economic exploitation, as Marx defined, is one of the things that would end up overall oppressing you enough that you would be completely divorced from the field of value itself. But even in contexts where you are kind of released from the kind of labor structures Marx was talking about, which happens in certain types of post-industrial contexts, you're still in a situation where the modern worldview has made it almost impossible to not be alienated from value. And so last time we were talking about, what does it mean to have a non-arbitrary conversation about the nature of the good life? This is the most fundamental educational question. We are not in a position with our youth to be able to talk about virtuous, forms of character that are demonstrably worth striving for, right? Instead, we have this kind of like paucity of language about value, which means we're not close to value. Value is actually this thing where if you really get it, and we'll talk about the eye of value, it's not the case that you are shrugging, maybe I'm committed, maybe I'm not committed to this thing. Like, oh, maybe it's just like my opinion, man, that this way of being is better than that way of being. That's alienation from value, because the presence of actual living value is not like ambivalent as we are about so much. So that alienation is not always like in your face existential despair. Often it is this much more subtle kind of intimacy disorder, which isn't, let's say, clinical, like it's subclinical intimacy disorder, which is just this like low grade friction and low grade mediation in terms of how I relate to the field of value. And so we talk about 13, but in fact, there's probably more. The 13 are the ones that we identify and name, but because the field of value is everywhere, the possibility to be alienated from it is also everywhere. And so that's a little bit of a way in. I think Mark kind of opened it up and get more specific. And if we walk through the 13, you can see the different shades of it and begin to feel your own interiority.
Yeah. And you know, maybe in layman, you'll take us through the 13 and ask about which ones most fascinate, you know, in that Greek sense of the word, fascinate you. But maybe just one more piece of just context, because it's such a big deal, you know, as Zach was pointing towards, and it's so non-trivial, and it's so, you know, misunderstood. So just to remind us, we're not talking about values, we're talking about value. Right. And there's a set of terminologies that we've tried to articulate in cosmologic humanism, right, which include the field of value, a universal grammar of value, which is constructed essentially from, not in a constructivist way, from first principles and first values, which give us not a new story, but a new story of value, and particularly a new story of evolving value. So those are that key set of terminologies. And so it's worth maybe jumping in on one alienation, which is the alienation from value itself, right? Because that's one of the alienations. That's a great place to start. And maybe a way into that, and we can talk about it in many different ways, but it's just, what is value, right? And I was just stop for a second and just like, well, what do we mean by value? And maybe just even one sentence before, we just got a note actually recently from David, and he left a note at the door, you know, is scribbled. So I guess he must have been in a rush. It was there early in the morning when we got up, and he asked us to kind of take a whole thing I've been working on for many, many years. And Zach's been working on a related domain completely independently. And I call it personal myth, and Zach called it metapsychology, and he really wants to get involved. And so one of the things we were talking about was shame, right? Shame. And at its core, when you get underneath the kind of Freudian sense of shame as inhibition of life force, which generated lots of the kind of popular Brene Brown kind of expressions of shame, there's a much deeper shame. And without going down that road, which is this ontological shame, but at its core, shame is alienation from value. And it's very deep. It's like, oh, right. Shame is when you experience yourself as stopping short of infinity, right? In other words, when you experience this sense at the same time of your subjectification, here I am, right? You know, and at the same time as you experience your subjectification, as Agamben, you know, points out, you experience your desubjectification, right? Here I am, and that's the Garden of Eden story. Right, the Garden of Eden story is interpreted by Christian lore and much of Jewish lore as being situational shame. The girl sinned. It got fucked up, right? Situational shame. But actually, the deeper understanding of the text, for multiple reasons, longer conversation, is that it's actually ontological shame, right? It's the shame of my experience of desubjectification as I experience myself as a subject. And that's the movement from the pre-tragic to the tragic. Right, this tragic sense of being alienated from value out of which I go through this process of deepening, moving from the tragic to the post-tragic, and I actually relocate myself in the field of value, not only in the field of value, but as an irreducibly unique incarnation of value, what we would call unique self or homo amor. And I'll close with this. There is a very, very beautiful man who was on our board for a while at the think tank, just a great guy, and has done just brilliant work, with men for 40, 50, 60 years in Monterey, in Central California. His name is Fred Jealous. And Fred read the Unique Self book, and he just wrote us a note, and he said, unique self is an affront to shame. It's very beautiful. He just kind of he just got it, right? It's this affront, this realization, I am value. It's not just thou art that is value, right? The Tao is not just the ground. The Tao is, as we translate, the field of value. So this sense that I'm alienated from value, and value has these two dimensions, right? Value is that you recognize value because it's for its own sake. It's both non-instrumental, and yet it points beyond itself. That's its paradox, right? It's non-instrumental, right? And yet it points towards something. So it's for its own sake, right? And our clarified need and our clarified desire actually point towards value. So there's these two dimensions of value, and I want to turn to Mr. Z, right? But it's so value is one, it's for its own sake, and two, value is disclosed by need and desire, right? Clarified need and clarified desire equals clarified value, and now we have a conversation, right? So the alienation either from my own need, my own clarified need, or the alienation from my clarified desire, or the alienation from that which is non-instrumental, right? Everything becomes measurable and commodifiable, and the priceless and the immeasurable disappears. So now we begin to understand one of those 13, which is the alienation from value itself. So that it's a good, I think, a wonderful way into the conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of ways I could go on that. I'm quite interested in the implied intentional elements in shame and in the particular details that distinguish a neutral perception of Tao from perception of Tao as value. But maybe I want to zero in on some of the more concrete diagnostic tributaries of the alienation from the field of value, and jump right back to the beginning around the win-lose metrics. It's where the section starts. I guess people are familiar listening to this probably with the Game B critique of rivalrous games. But I think there's an interesting question here around what is it that specifically that gets alienated or goes unrecognized in our reality when we view people or are viewed by people as basically competitors for a finite quantity of resources and status.
We lost you there, brother.
Yeah, that would be, as Mark is mentioning, so if you think about the nature of perceiving another person, right? So you think about the nature of perceiving another person. If you were in a zero-sum competition with that person, then they are a means to your victory, which means they are not an end in themselves. They are not useful in any other way except to be the one who's below you in this competition. And so the ubiquity, or let's say the overwhelming imperative to only ever be engaging in competitive relationships turns every relationship into an instrumental relationship, right? So that there is an alienation from both the intrinsic value of others and oneself, and the intrinsic value of a relationship, which is not instrumentalized, right? And so this is one of the things that I think produces shame, right? So the evidence of the intimacy disorder, or the evidence of the presence of alienation, is the presence of shame, right? Because there's a sense of there's something tremendously valuable here, which I am desecrating, right? And it's the same way we relate to nature, right? When you drive past some ridiculously hideous kind of like strip mall that has taken a beautiful forest and turned it into concrete to sell crap, the reaction to that is one of shame. How could we have done this? How could we have taken something that was so clearly valuable as an end in itself? And actually, so you feel not like me, I don't like, but it's like for the whole species, you're feeling a sense of like the species itself is at this point shameless in reaction to the overwhelming shame that they should be, that we should be, that we are actually in a subconscious level experiencing because of the alienation from value. And in this case, it's our brothers and sisters. Like if you think about high school, right? The college admittance game, like the competition to get into college, is one of the most cutthroat zero-sum competitions you'll ever be in your life. And it's the thing that characterizes all of your relationships with your friends in high school, whether you like it or not. And so that is a place where we are forced into a relation of misperceiving the value of our brothers and sisters. And so I think that's kind of getting at that. So you can imagine a situation where there are contexts in which competition is not relevant, right? And it's even hard to imagine that, but these contexts exist. A good conversation would be that. Argument, no. Conversation, yes, right? Even conversations with disagreements. But the for its own sakeness of a conversation is an example of an interpersonal relationship where we're not competing. We're not just sitting there in silence, and we're not the same person. We're actually having this generative, creative, non-competitive conversation that benefits both of us and the rest of the world, and instantiates value, expresses value, allows value to be realized. So there's so many relational dynamics that reveal value, allow us to share value, and allow us to enjoy the non-instrumentalizability of each other, just to bask in the inviolable goodness of being with another human being. We have to go hunting for those places. Like we have to go desperately searching for the places where we would not be subject to being instrumentalized or competed with. So that first one is a pretty good one because it shows that we take it for granted, in fact, that the majority of our relationships are instrumental relationships. The majority of our communication is coercive, that we're mostly in environments where we are not treated as ends in ourselves, nor are we in a position to treat others as ends in themselves. We have to kind of create places where that's possible and then protect those places from what the broader system is doing, which is turning everything into a vast system of objects that are interrelated as instrumentally. So yes, that's a little bit of a reflection on the nature of that.
Yeah. Maybe Layman, before we go to the next one, that was great. And just to kind of play and dance a little bit with Zach, with Z in this field, because it's such a beautiful field, right? You think about it, and let's maybe just dance a little bit in the lineage, in the great lineages, and particularly, we try and move through the lineages that are both pre-modern, modern, and postmodern. But I would say that one of our orienting lineages is what we would call the lineage of Solomon, which, many years ago I characterized as non-dual humanism. And we kind of deepened it into cosmorotic humanism. And this kind of there was a very beautiful moment that Zach and myself and Barb Marks Hubbard and Christina were together, in an apartment someplace, and cosmorotic humanism was born. I think we can both remember that exact moment, like in 2017. But, it came out of a conversation. And in the lineage, the word Messiah, very beautiful word, Messiah, it's Mashiach. And Mashiach means siach, conversation, right? And this understanding that the monadic structure of reality is a series of conversations. That's what reality is. It's a series of conversations. And in fact, it's a conversational cosmos, which is itself a broader conversation. It's a conversational cosmos all the way up and all the way down the evolutionary chain. It's a conversation. And conversation means there's a mutual field of value, which is ultimately non-competitive and non-local, right? In which every instrument is playing, right? Every unique self, whatever that means, right? At whatever level that self that is expressing is playing its instrument. And there's this stunning synergy of music that emerges that's unimaginably, beautiful. And when we're not in that, we're shamed, right? Because that is actually the nature of reality, right? One of the things that we often say to each other is, value is not hard to find, value is impossible to avoid, right? Values in it. So we kind of, for lots of reasons, we shifted away from kind of the classical medieval trilogy, of the eye of the senses and the eye of the mind and the eye of the spirit, right? Because the eye of the spirit's insufficient for multiple reasons. And we talk about the eye of consciousness, right, which has these 4 dimensions. And one is the eye of the heart, and the other is the eye of contemplation. The third is the eye of the spirit. And we're not going to talk about all those right now. It's a different conversation. It's actually coming up in a symposium. But the fourth is the eye of value. And in this notion of the eye of value is this capacity to perceive value because we're participatory in value, because it is actually our inherent nature. And when I'm alienated from intimacy with my own nature, I'm shamed. That's precisely the nature of shame. And so maybe I'm just going to add one thing before we go on, just which I think is just really helpful. And one is, if I can, step out of the philosopher role and into the rabbi role for a second, right? My rabbi self, which is, and I'm speaking to myself out loud, we have to search for and insanely value those moments that are priceless, right? That are non-commodifiable, right? In other words, and it's just so easy for them to get lost, right? And yet they are the only things we're going to remember on our deathbed. Everything else literally is going to fall away. And paradoxically, as we face mortality and all the win and lose metrics fall away, the only thing that we're going to collect and remember is those moments where we're ultimately valuable. And for example, Layman, I can remember, standing with you outside the backyard of this house and a little conversation we had before you went to the car. And I can see us having that particular conversation as you're going to the car. And I think Christina had a lot of cheese, right? That was, available after we'd been sitting on the porch, right? And there was nothing accomplished on that day, on that afternoon when we all sat on the porch. There was no books written, no plans drawn, no strategies enacted. We sat on the porch and we all, drank wine. And then I remember the conversation on the way back to the car, right? And why do I remember it? Because we were on the inside. We were on the inside of the inside. It was a beautiful moment, and it wasn't for something, and it was stunning, right? And so that sense and what that points towards, and this is the last just thought, is, and this is a broader conversation that Zach and I are talking about now all the time, which is, and because, again, we talk about things because David kind of gives us pointers, David J. Temple, but the relationship itself between eros and existential risk, right? In other words, we live in a planet drenched in shame, right? And shame is not a personal emotion. Shame is a planetary emotion. We live in a planet drenched in shame. And you can't even begin to approach the meta crisis from a simply, although infrastructure is critical and social structure is critical, but unless we go deeper and actually understand the interior architectonic of the planet as drenched in shame, which then demands races to the bottom, which demands tragedies of the commons, right, which demands, the multiple modalities of pseudo-eros to cover up, right, the glaring shame when I can't actually realize that I am the infinity of value, right, which is uniquely appearing in me, as me, and through me. Anything else is a searing shame that rips me apart, right? And so eros and existential risk, it's not like, oh, we're turning towards eros. Now, what we're saying is you can't even begin to approach existential risk unless you can reweave the fabric of eros in a post-tragic way.
Yeah. And unless there's something like the possibility of redemption, which would be reweaving yourself into the field of value. So we're at a state now, I believe, with the planetary culture, which is so, as Mark's saying, appropriately drenched in shame, that we're looking at dynamics that are actually suicidal. Like, one way to think about the meta crisis is that it is a civilizational suicide, in fact. And one of the drivers of that, I would argue, is the unprocessability of this shame because of the absence of a discourse about value that would allow for redemption, right? So it's like we've destroyed this world and there is no chance that we can actually make good. There's no chance that we can actually save face. There's no chance that we can actually redeem the generations to come from our misdeeds. And so it's this weird thing where we don't believe in value, but it's there. So therefore we react with shame that we can't quite understand, because really it shouldn't matter. If the universe is meaningless, it really shouldn't matter. We shouldn't feel anything about having destroyed all the trees and animals and the mass extinctions and the oppression and the slavery. Like, why would that matter if the universe didn't matter? But it does. So we react with shame, but then we don't have the language to allow us to save face, to allow us to come back, to atone, right? To make good, as I said, with reality itself. And so that is an impossibility. Then the only reaction would be to annihilate yourself, to be relieved from this incomprehensible emotional discomfort, which you don't even really have the language to put to. And so that's the kind of desperation that leads to the knowing path towards destruction, which is what we're on now, the knowing path towards self-termination. Similar to what would happen if you were an adolescent and you had made some horrible mistake and there was no chance of being redeemed or touched again by your family. And what do? Desperation, right? Downward spiral into annihilation. And so, as Mark's saying, we can't, yes, we could, there's a lot of technical scientific problems that need to be solved, but it won't matter if we can't actually talk to each other in a way that will allow us to redeem ourselves, that would allow us to actually become part again with the field of value, part and parcel, the prodigal son returning to the field of value, as it were.
We'll turn to layman. Just that language of saving face is so good, Z, right? In other words, I was just in Brussels, and I was sitting with a young man, 15-year-old, a beautiful young man, and he was showing me Snapchat, right? And so he's got about 100 friends on Snapchat who are all essentially sending each other faces. That's what's happening on Snapchat. You send your face. And then there's a new app just trending right now, right, called Get Real. I don't remember the exact name of it, in which you send a picture of your face and it takes a picture of what's behind and has two cameras, behind your face and in front of your face. And so essentially you see both, you get like 100 things of faces of your friend, right? And groups of faces of your friend. Now, there's what to mock in this, obviously, but there's also this desperation, right, to recover face, right? In other words, underneath that which is so apparently an empty gesture, this, this kind of, this paralyzed force, this gesture without motion, right, is this desperation to share my face. And my face is, in Hebrew, if you've ever been in a synagogue and you're about 7 years old, there's a man who walks around the synagogue and he grabs your cheek and he twists it quite hard as he offers you, some bubble gum, and he says, Azer Shena Panim. And panim means face. And panim, face, means pnimi. It means insideness. And it's also lifnei, to be before. So the languages, let's say in Leviticus, about being before God, really mean to recover face, meaning to be on the inside of God's face. Before God means to be on the inside of God's face, right? And when I'm not on the inside of God's face, right, I'm filled with shame, and then I'm desperate to have my face recognized, and that's and so the social media moment, which is so devastating, and which we're writing about in Techno-Feudalism, but is this desperate cry to be recognized, and that's part of what intimacy is, the mutuality of recognition, the mutuality of feeling, right? We're just noticing, just even in the conversation today, and it's fresh and it's alive. We can't engage existential risk outside of frames like global intimacy disorder, rooted in alienations from the field of value. You can't even jumpstart the conversation. And so it's so good to be having this conversation.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean Levinas, right? The kind of whole philosophies of the face as a portal into value, your face as a portal into unique value, and then of course the reaction of shame is to cover your face. The reaction of literally just like you put your hands in your face, like that's the reaction of shame psychoanalytically, like across all cultures. Shame is you hide your face. Yeah. Don't look at me, right? You're coming out of the jailhouse. You kind of put your hood up so no one can see you, and so that sense of yes, see me, see me fully for what I've done in a way that can redeem me. And you're right, Mark, to see the kind of like potentially pseudo erotic, pseudo intimacy that's created with things like Snapchat, and yet it's linking into this deep desire, need, which is the value of being seen, the value of your face.
This inconsolable yearning, right, to be seen, right? Face. There's 45 muscles in the face, right? Which almost all of them are for that nuance, right? That unique interiority. And Levinas, in fact, right, picks up on the book of Genesis, which is a different conversation and different, right? But the essential story in the book of Genesis is about the movement towards face of individuals. And the essential movement of the book of Exodus is about the movement of face to face, right, within the context of community. So in other words, Genesis is the intimate communion of personal face to face, and Exodus is the intimate communion of communal face to face. And without being face to face, we are defaced and debased. Yeah. So yes, it's good to be together.
Well, first of all, I'm going to friend God on Snapchat. That's coming up. Second of all, my mind goes to, solutions, schemes for all this stuff. Obviously, there's a philosophical aspect of reframing the world. In the beginning was the dialogue, some kind of redemption narrative. We can improvise or study strategies of communication for bringing in the valorized otherness of humans that might get alienated in win-lose metrics. We can seek out or create non-instrumental spaces, and almost certainly we need to become more willing to be with the experience of the desecration in order to get into those spaces more authentically. But as I think about strategies, and also I try to pivot from the first to the second of what we're clearly not going to get all through, these 13. The second one is the domination of complex system by complicated systems. I think you called it the Taleb point, essentially. And there's a question around the strategies for dealing with complexity that make complexity something we can engage with in a non-alienated way. Like one of the reasons to favor complicated approaches is because we have technical strategies for handling them. And one of the reasons we alienate complexity so quickly is we don't really have a scheme for it. And Taleb tries to bring forward an alternative, which is like general heuristics for handling an opaque and complex universe in order to get back in touch with what was left out of complex systems models. Is that approach, is what Taleb's doing, bringing forward something really important here in sort of undoing this kind of alienation? And is it insufficient? And if it's insufficient, what other general kinds of strategies could we apply to de-alienate the complex?
Yeah. I mean, maybe I'll jump in, Zach, and go out. So, and by the way, it just flashed through my mind, right? You're in a good conversation when you're eager to hear your friend talk, right? And that's the kind of conversation you should be in, right? It's a beautiful moment. So let's bracket Taleb just for a second, although I invoked him. And if I can, invoke a distinction that we make in cosmologic humanism between complex and complicated systems, which I think will help, right? Which is, obviously, numerous theorists kind of engage in various forms of this. Snowden did a good Harvard, review article, which kind of sums up a lot of it. Taleb does his version of it. But let's just go kind of in the way we talk about it through one essential distinction, which is allurement. In other words, in a complicated system, there is not allurement between parts, right? So a Ferrari, which has many pieces and parts to it, but the parts are not allured, and therefore it's fragile, right? Because if you're missing a part, then the factory closes down and it doesn't quite fit together. And so you're relying on mechanics and some dimension of scientific law, but only at the it level, right? To kind of hold this thing together, as best we can, right? A Brazilian rainforest, right, which is a kind of a larger system. And it's, I think, the example, I believe, if I remember correctly, that Snowden actually invokes, right, is that a very, very, very complex system in which there's an allurement between the parts, meaning that all the parts are in relationship to the whole. Now, the nature of that allurement has to evolve. I want to be very clear, right? In other words, when you have a proton, a neutron, and electron, right? So there is both, and this is very important, there's shared identity, it becomes an atom. It's shared identity in the context of otherness. You don't lose, right, the proton, neutron, and electron. And then you have this mutuality of recognition, this mutuality of feeling pathos, this mutuality of value, and this mutuality of purpose. So there's got to be an evolution of complex systems in which, right, we move from this kind of very narrow myopic view, right, both in terms of separate self, but also in terms of history, right? Myopic, temporally, right? It's both temporally myopic, it's spatially myopic, and it's kind of myopic in the sense of I have a very, very limited view of a very, very narrow dimension of my own self. And I've got to move to an actual lived relationship with the whole. And I want to just maybe invoke one image of a model of it, right? And then turn to Z. Right? And in this sense, there's a 16th century thinker who was my teacher's teacher, right, within the Solomon lineage, Luria, Isaac Luria, who invokes this very beautiful formulation before he does anything. And the formulation is, L'shem yichud, kutshabrichu ushechinte. I do this action for the sake of the union between Shekhinah and Kutshabrichu, right? Let's say the yin and the yang of divinity, if you will, the upper waters and the lower waters. But in other words, the split off parts. So I do this individual action with an actual lived awareness of the field of value in which I live, in which lives in me and moves through me. And I become, borrowing from Bucky Fuller, right? Put Luria and Bucky Fuller together. I become omni-considerate and omni-responsible, for the sake of the whole. Right. And what's wondrous is that Luria was not suggesting only a formula for the elite in Safed, above the Sea of Galilee, in the 16th century. He was actually suggesting a formula for the entire community, right? He was suggesting kind of a pedagogical, educational structure that actually children are raised into, right? That you actually have direct access to the covenant between the generations. That you're actually able to shatter, right, the narrow shaming locality, right, in all of its levels, and actually have a lived experience, none of only shared identity with the whole, it's shared identity in the context of otherness. I'm radically individuated, and yet I literally can feel the whole moving through me, and that experience, right, is at the core of a complex system, right? And you can't engage a complex system means there's an allurement between the parts, right? And the way we say it, maybe the last image is there's a phrase in cosmologic humanism which clarified like a decade ago, which is the sense of your need is my allurement. Your need is my allurement. And this notion of your need is my allurement, if we have it at all, right? We have it with this very narrow 1.5 people or 1.3 people, if we have it at all. And that's already miraculous if we have that with anyone, right? But actually, the evolution of your need is my allurement from a kind of what Cook calls the song of the individual, we would call egocentric, to the song of the nation, Cook calls it ethnocentric, to the song of the world, Cook calls it, we would call it world-centric, to what he calls blessings, the song of the Yakum, of the cosmos, what we would call cosmocentric. So the evolution of your need is my allurement, but an actual experience, right? And it's experience we have in the sexual, right? Your need is my allurement. Your need's no longer a burden, right? But in the field of the sensual, your need is my allurement, right? So, if I could say it dramatically, when need becomes fuck, there'll be no more hungry people, right? I mean, and I mean that kind of elusively, right? Kind of, right? In a kind of, architectonic, right? And that's what we mean, that the sensual models the entire field of Eros, but it doesn't even begin to exhaust it. There's 12 billion years of Eros before there's any sex. It's about Eros. That's what it's about. But so it's this notion of allurement, right? A complex system that can't operate without allurement at its core. So something like that to begin, right? To approach that second alienation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot in there. Let me think about what to say. I would say a couple of things. One is I would say that the tendency of our institutions and technologies to turn the complex into the complicated is one of the things that needs to be thought about, right? Because there are ways that humans have operated where they actually embrace the complex and learn to manage and grapple with the complex without turning it into the complicated, right? So my background in standardized testing showed this very, very, very clearly, which is basically you take the student teacher or class teacher relationship, which is a very complex. Each kid is a complex dynamical system. The whole combined class is a crazy complex dynamical system. The teacher themselves is, so the whole thing is massively complex. Now, good teacher actually does what's called a topographical refactoring of the complexity, which is just getting on top of it. And you start to get these intuitions like, okay, that kid tomorrow or in a couple of days is going to be a problem because I can kind of see how his energy is fluctuating. And so the good teacher, as other professionals do, like Howard Gardner talked about professionals as people who make complex, considered judgments under conditions of uncertainty, right? Now, what a bureaucratized decision-making system does that layers standardized testing on top of the student and the teacher relationship is to reduce the complexity of the situation and to make it so you don't have to make a complex, considered judgment in a condition of uncertainty. Actually, you're making a complicated, simple judgment under a condition of contrived predictability, right? And so it's a very different and, in fact, complexity reducing initiative drive in our modern institutions. And there's a complexity reducing kind of psychological disposition that therefore has been reinforced. And this is what Mark was getting at, which is that we could, in fact, train our young people to always be thinking about the things that are excluded as a part of their current operating, which is to say, I'm doing this for the sake of uniting everything. I'm not doing this for the sake of putting this thing out here and never looking at it again, which is what happens when you reduce the complex to the complicated. You create these kind of like places where we just don't have to look because we've simplified the complexity. That doesn't matter. I don't need that. Those outliers are irrelevant. Whereas L'Shemehud Kachabrahu is basically like for the sake of the uniting, like every action try to gather, which means anti-complicated, means pro-complexity, right? It means that we're actually pursuing all the subtleties that might be neglected, right? We're pursuing all the schismogenic outcomes that we could be creating by accident in order to make them part of this thing, not something that's excluded. So there's a psychological disposition that is reinforced by our bureaucratic habits, which are to just reduce complexity to the complicated, and therefore we get freaked out by the complex. That's why we mow our lawns and do other weird ass stuff to nature. Like we refuse to deal with nature as a truly complex thing. So if you look at like permaculture practices as opposed to large scale kind of like mass agricultural practice. There you have a similar thing where the large scale kind of agro businesses run on the reduction of complexity into the complicated. It's like, oh, I want to ship that tomato across the country. That's hard to do because tomatoes go bad. So what I'll do is I'll engineer a tomato that can be shipped across the country, which will be so identical to all the other tomatoes. We can actually package them in pre-made packages because we know exactly how big the tomato is going to get, right? So that is not agriculture. That's something else. Permaculture is where the human relates to the complex dynamical system in a way that embraces its complexity so that you leverage precisely the autonomy and complexity and self-organization of the thing. You, just like a good teacher would, you liberate the complexity rather than actually controlling and limiting and eventually making it so that it actually isn't complex, that it is just this complicated, fragile, predictable, measurable, controllable object, which is not an end in itself. Please.
That's great. No, that's great. That's great. I mean, and pardon my kind of naive childlike enthusiasm in this moment, but it just occurred to me, Layman, perhaps we'll get as far as we get today, but maybe we'll do one more, whatever it takes to, because finishing these has great value. I'm feeling just the value of this, and I'm giving, and again, we're not allowed to get excited, right? And as children get excited, but if you get excited, there's somehow, and actually the quality of dharma, of kind of new structures of thought emerging is the permission to get excited. So I'm excited about being in this conversation. I'm delighted. I just have the sense of delight, and I want to borrow one of Zach's hats, which is the educational hat, for just a moment. And because you were just talking, Zach, I think so beautifully about this notion in education, and we were talking about L'Shem Yichud being a structural, communal, pedagogical, and as you were pointing before, Layman, you were saying solutions, right? That you begin to see something here. So just a couple of points are worth making. One, we just did this beautiful event in Europe called The Crossing. You're crossing over from Homo sapien to Homo amor, and there was a central, and I generally deploy Cohen's Hallelujah, often because it comes from very deep in the Solomon lineage, which he was very deeply associated with. And there's a reason why there's more cover songs of Hallelujah, right, than any other single song, and it kind of, his famous exchange with Dylan. When he asked Dylan, how long did it take you to write your best song? Dylan says 15 minutes. And Cohen says, I've been torturing over this 150 verses. It's got this long, history. It finally gets from the Velvet Underground to Jeff Buckley, and then records it in 93. And then Buckley's, tragically swept away in the Mississippi River. And that's when it begins to emerge. And all of a sudden people are saying, oh, there's something here. And this something here is this innate sense that even though it all went wrong, I stand before the Lord of Song, nothing on my tongue but hallelujah. And hallelujah means it's all value. Hallelujah means I'm in the field of value. It means hallel, right? Just like whether hallel means drunken intoxication and radical praise, it's all Yah, right? It's all the breath of value. That's hallelujah. And we played at this event this incredible clip of a teacher with, a bunch of, I guess, 10-year-old kids, children doing hallelujah. And you watch their faces and it just blows your heart open because they get hallelujah. They haven't gone through, the marble arch and the agonies and, ecstasies of love. And they haven't gone through, all that Leonard Cohen's gone through, and they haven't gone through David and Bathsheba, right? So, which is the basis, in the Book of Kings of the first verse, but they get it. You watch them sing, and the capacity of children, we eject children in education from the field of value. That's what we're doing today. We eject them from the field of intimacy, right? We eject them from the field of eros. So instead of education being this opening, it's actually shocking, right? We literally educate to anti-value, right? And I remember my my son was one of, many, many kids in the world where I was trying to get him to read. So I just want to stay with education and children for a second. And I couldn't quite get him to read. And then Harry Potter came out. And he was, right. And then tens of millions of children in the world start reading Harry Potter because Harry Potter says, it's your imagination, not just your imagination. Your imagination is homo imago Dei, right? You're of the image of God. You're imagining it because it's real. And there's a field of magic. And magic means the hills are alive, right? And that there's a field of eros value. And so that's kind of two. And then finally, the last point, I want to pick up at that, Zach, that beautiful word that, slipped in, which is the word, I think you used the word narrow, right? And there's narrowing, right? Which is, I think, again, so essential. Trauma at its core is the narrowing of focus, right? And as you step out of the wide places, you can't feel the larger field, right? And your focus narrows to this very, very narrow point from which you cannot liberate yourself, right? And so the healing of trauma is to go back into that narrow place. And in the lineage of Solomon, that's called Egypt. Egypt is Mitzrayim, the Meitzar, it's the narrow place. So I've got to go into the traumatized place. So we educationally traumatize our children, right? By essentially dismissing their own inconsolable longings and calling the essential grandness of their being grandiosity, right? And it's criminal, right? We actually destroy, it's soul destroying, and soul destroying, of course, induces shame, right? And now we're back to our planet drenched in shame. And so this is not this is not an abstract conversation, right? This is has the most real policy implications on every level, right? That need to be, right, taken into account, and as a ground for, right, this actual re-engagement and this responding to this meta crisis, which is rooted in this field of pseudo eros, which is ultimately grounded in this shame. So this for the second intimacy disorder, the second alienation.
Well, I think today we're not even going to get halfway down this list, so I'm perfectly happy to have us do another session of childish excitement around these things. There was another beautiful word that Zach used, which was schismogenic. And it led me to think about the difference between like a membrane that is generative and a membrane that is a broken alienating circuit, which is an interesting way for me to think into the third alienation, which is between different ways of knowing. And I think people often simplify that one to the gap between the sciences and the humanities. They're each blind to each other, and they're collectively blind to something that comes forth in transdisciplinarity. But we need to have spaces with strong membranes to enable people to specialize in uncontaminated ways. So looking at the problem of alienation between ways of knowing, how do we get that membrane correct? How do we not have too little and not have too much?
You want to start this one, brother?
So it's a great way to frame it, actually, in terms of these membranes, because our definition of intimacy includes otherness, right? So that's and similarly with eros includes also the separation and the coming together, right? And intimacy is the me and you. If it's just me, you in confusion, then the membrane's not there. That's actually not intimate. It's actually just fusion. Well, so intimacy really has to do with precisely the kinds of boundaries or membranes which allow for the deepening of the individuality of the component pieces at the same time that they benefit from the symbiosis of their relationship across difference, right? And in the domain of epistemology, I think this begins not with the special sciences, but with again, back to education. It begins with the appropriate relationship between the hemispheres in the McGill-Christian sense. Which is to say, we can't solve later in graduate school what began very, very early in grade school, which was as Mark said, systematic kind of abuse of the child to the extent that they get a left hemispheric dominance pattern, which it makes it almost impossible for them to build certain types of integrative forms of knowledge, right? So that would be my first kind of like foray. Would be there's all kinds of stuff in the level of higher education bureaucracy and like the way that journals work and peer review works and the ethnocentrism of the disciplines and all of these things up here. But at a very fundamental level, when we begin the work of teaching children about their own minds, and when we begin the work of teaching them what it means to know things. So, for example, I'm in the habit of saying quite often that humans are able to say true things. Humans have said true things before science existed. And humans can say true things who know nothing about science. Sorry, guys. Like, not you guys, but like, sorry to everyone who would teach a little kid that, in fact, the only people in our society who say things are true are scientists, which is what most people kind of default believe, that, in fact, the people who do the humanities, the work, they don't really say, they're not, that's just like opinion or emotion. And in fact, your doctor, right, knows more about your body than you do. So shut up and listen to him, right? Or any other number of examples where we are alienated from our own ability to say true things by being confused about the nature of legitimate teacherly authority and the very nature of what knowledge is. So, for example, you can say true things about non-measurable realities. Like, that's another one that we are kind of like pushed away from belief in school very, very strongly. Even if it's never explicitly said, that there are phenomena that are real, that are measurable, that are physical, that are observable, which can be, so you can say true things about. And then there are these other things which you can't measure, which cannot be observed, like love, which are less real and therefore cannot be part of a truth stating discourse. So I think we have to upend quite a bit of that at a very early age. And again, unite young people with their true grandeur, which is the ability to deploy the eye of value to see what is true and good. Now, it doesn't mean that they don't need to be educated, of course, but you build upon that, deepening them into the field of value, rather than saying, actually, don't trust your intuitions, kid. Actually, don't trust your ability to make sense of things. Put your trust in these scientists / experts / technocrats who will tell you what is true. And then it's your job to repeat the true things said by other people who are more qualified to know what is true. Whereas I'm saying, whoa, like if I was going to make a manipulable population that was subject to oppression and confusion about the nature of their own being and advertising, winning the day, and I would teach that way. I would make people distrust their own ability to know what is true and to be able to say what is true. And again, so in that case, schooling, what is school for? It's not about saying true things. It's about getting into college. It's about competing with your neighbor. So if you diffuse that discourse, you can also move into this other way of relating to all kinds of intellectual projects, which are an absence of seriousness. So I think that, to me, it begins there. It begins with what are the epistemologies and the hidden curriculum of our schooling, which leads us, by the time we get to graduate school, to not even blink an eye when we listen to the ethnocentrism of the disciplines that's part of our doctoral training, which is to say your discipline is the best one. All those other people are idiots, right? If you're an economist, that's the one. The biologists and the physicists are stupid. If you're a physicist, then that's the one. The biologists and the economists are stupid. If you're a psychologist, if you go into education, you're on the short end of the stick there. So you're not even allowed to believe that education is important. But most of the other disciplines claim their ethnocentric truth as the primary truth of their perspective. So the competitive zero-sum dynamic plays out across the disciplines. And that's rooted ultimately in a psychological / epistemological kind of malformation that occurs quite young, which distorts our ability to trust our own minds, to know what is true and good.
Yeah, I mean that's a great way in. And kind of so since Zach started there so beautifully, I'm gonna go back and go back to the beginning, right? So we talk about this alienation between ways of knowing, And I remember it was 2006 in the summer, and I was in Salt Lake City, and I read the book Women's Ways of Knowing, at that kind of, that early book. And I remember how shocking the book was, because while the book pointed to important new epistemologies, right, it was also essentially invalidating. It was so radically polarized. And I was just so surprised. Why would you say that science is completely invalid because it doesn't fit into women's ways of knowing? And I began to get this sense of the epistemological wars taking place, at this kind of early moment. So let's just kind of go to the beginning. So first, knowing is carnal. That's just the first thing we want to say, and man knew his wife Eve, and Eve knew her husband. So, Genesis, 4. So knowing itself is carnal. Seinfeld wasn't wrong, yada, yada, yada. So yada, right, is to know, right? And when I know, I always know carnally, right? And so knowing itself is eros, right? So knowing itself is intimacy. That's the point. Knowing is an intimate act, right? And so not to be able to know, if there's nothing to know, right, it's non-intimate, but also if there's a kind of alienation between carnalities, between erotic forms of knowing, and those can't actually be intimate with each other, right? If forms of knowing are non-intimate with each other, then you actually shatter the field of intimacy, you shatter the field of eros, and then you shatter the field of knowledge. Because what you basically have is a triumphalist move, right? Only my kind of knowing yields knowledge, right? I then disqualify other dimensions of knowledge, and I don't actually allow them to have place. So that's kind of just the beginning. And that takes us into this realization that, which is kind of the second point, which is that I can know things, or that I can speak truth, that I have the capacity to know, right, in multiple modalities. And that is the essential nature of my being. I'm a being who both bows before the mystery, and I'm a being who knows, right? And I mean, another way to say this, and I was writing early in 2016 and thinking about this, and I wrote an essay, which is actually now just coming to fruition, right, in the beginning of a project that we worked on at the think tank called The Phenomenology of Eros, about these 7 structures of Eros. And the essay was about phenomenology as ontology, that the split between phenomenology and ontology is a false split, just like the split between hedon and daemon. Right? In early Greek thought is essentially a false split at a bad split. Eros and agape, these are bad splits, right? These are splits that are actually undermine, right, kind of culture in a very fundamental way. And so there's this realization that phenomenology is ontology, right, at its very core, right, allows me then to reclaim my dignity, right? And it's very paradoxical. There's when you look at Aquinas and Maimonides, so they both make this wildly paradoxical move. They both say no God, right? The ultimate, right? The ultimate commandment is no God, and love and knowledge are completely related, right? To love is to know, and to know is to love. So there's this tight intertexturing between the experience of knowing and the experience of loving, which is again the kind of root experience of knowing. And then they say, and there's nothing you can know about God, right? God is unknowable, right? Via negativa, right? In the East, neti neti. Right? There's nothing to be known. It's all mystery. And that's exactly the stance that we need to take, right? We actually enter into a form of knowing, right? We actually affirm not the certainty that it is true, but the certainty that I am true, that my phenomenology is true. And then from there, I can get to knowing something that's true. I can begin to have certainties of being and certainties of reality, which all bow before the mystery. Right? And as we never overreach the certainty to occlude the mystery, because we're afraid to be in the space in between. We're afraid to be in the emptiness, because the emptiness is too empty, instead of the emptiness being full, instead of the emptiness being, right, the pregnant space. And so we have this utter need to actually access our own interiority, which is the ground of what David J. Temple started to talk about in 2016-17, when he coined this term anthro-ontology, which is really core to this whole thing, right? Anthro, human being, ontology, I know, right? And it's this anthro-ontological method. We can know things, and we can know things through multiple ways of knowing, each of which, as Zach said, right, each of us are part of a field of knowing, and yet each is utterly a unique vector of knowing. And that capacity begins to invoke the possibility of a new human who knows through eros, right? And its knowing is no longer a mechanical function, right? Knowing is a participatory function, right? In the field of eros, knowing is an intimate function, and it's actually never been any different, right? And that's actually the nature of knowing. When I split knowing off from the field of eros and the field of intimacy, right, I get something that is violent, at its core. There's a beautiful text, from the book of Job in chapter 19. And, in a different lifetime, I had an enormously powerful desire, which I did not fulfill, to write a book or multiple volumes on the history of this verse, right? And the verse is, through my body, I vision God. Right? This verse from the book of Job, this very, very beautiful verse. And you can trace that verse through the lineage of Solomon, through Christian readings of the verse, through Islamic readings of the verse. It's a very, very, right? But through my body, I vision God. And the second I can't vision God, meaning I can't know. I can't both know and bow to the mystery at the same time. I can't hold this dialectic between certainty and uncertainty, which is appropriate. And I can hold that paradox of certainty and uncertainty, because now culture splits between the certain, we're either, kind of lost in a kind of new age or fundamentalist fantasy, right? Or a kind of postmodern uncertainty, right? Which is, we know nothing, when actually reality is a dialectical, paradoxical field, right? Of a radical set of certainties with a radical set of mysteries, right? And actually, one of the first principles and first values of reality is that the world's called in the lineage of Solomon olam. And olam means that which is virginal and full, and alum, it's hidden, right? It's this paradox between revealment, right, and concealment, right, is at the core of everything. And maybe the last thing that's worth saying, and I think we kind of begin to get a sense of this principle, is if I alienate from any dimension of knowing, I'm alienated from a dimension of myself. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm going to be very pragmatic here, but pragmatic in the sense of a sacred pragmatism. What that means is not that I have to engage myself in every form of knowing. And it's not everyone needs to do, the advanced forms of number sets and mathematical sets, right? And people who didn't recognize Gödel's incompleteness theorem, most of the people trying to do complete mathematical sense went crazy, right? So that's its own conversation. It's something that's worth talking about. And Daniel's talked about that very beautifully. But I need to have access, right, to all the forms of knowing. And what we do is we idolize, as you were saying, right? I mean, very correctly, we inappropriately quote Einstein on all sorts of things we shouldn't be quoting Einstein on, right? Because he was a blithering idiot about a lot of it. Hawking says things that are so unimaginably stupid in such a wide range of areas that you're actually shocked. And you realize, oh, this is a British aristocratic, particular strata of society, blithering idiot, right, about any number of domains other than his particular domain in physics. And we have this reductive, materialist, dogmatic notion that because he got a particular domain of physics correct, we should have any regard for what he says about things that he knows and has no access to at all. And so we've kind of exiled knowing to one particular vector of knowing. And what we need to do is actually access, right, an actual relationship to a very wide field of knowing. And the wider my field of knowing, and the more I actually understand that my particular field of knowing, right, is part of a larger field, the more I avoid the idolatry of my narrow epistemology. So epistemological idolatry demarcates, right, the field today, right? In other words, only my epistemology is sacred, and all others are defiled, invalid meaning they have no value, they're non-heroic, they have no valor. Right? There's nothing to be done there. And so this reclaiming of this wider field, right, and in which our knowledge moves from the scientific, to the interior sciences, and it's one of the reasons that cosmologic humanism has tried to deploy, right, a new set of languages. So we don't talk about consciousness, we talk about value, right? We talk about we don't talk about mysticism, we talk about the interior sciences, right? There's we talk about eros and intimacy and interior science equations, right? Because we have to actually establish this wider field of knowing, right? That is, epistemologically audacious and humble at the same time. And we need to educationally allow children and adults, right, to have the widest access to, here's the last sentence, because to the precise extent that I can't trust, right, a field or a vector of knowing, I'm split off, right, from myself. So, for example, desire is a form of knowing. Desire discloses value, right? If I demonize desire, well, then I torture people, right? That's what the demonization of desire does, right? Desire is a field of knowing. I clarify my desire, and then desire yields gnosis, yields value. Clarified desire yields clarified value. If I demonize desire, if desire is no longer a clarified, right, form of gnosis, right, then I basically wind up with a demonized vision of desire, which I can never clarify, which then leads me to horrors, right, of unimaginable kinds that we saw, for example, explode on October 7th, right? This demonization of desire that exploded in, the worst atrocities we've seen, but against the feminine in forever. So there's this sense of this alienation between the fields of knowing. Again, it is not a narrow cognitive problem that we're dealing with. That's what we were pointing. It's not like, oh, well, let's get the, as you said, it's very important to get the humanities and the sciences to talk, but it's not a technical problem, right? It's an ontological, political, right, global problem of the utmost kind, and fragmentation begins in the fragmentation of the field of knowing. So yes.
Yeah, that brings Nietzsche to mind for me. I think there's a lot of utility in the skepticism of suggesting we consider whether or not our ontology is really just a phenomenology. But that defaults to a materialistic frame unless you complement it with the reverse move that phenomenology is an ontology.
Exactly.
Puts us in a nice space. And what I hear you guys saying is we need robust contact with a trans-epistemological field that frames the relationship and intimacy of knowings between the disciplines, and that has to be prepared and set up with a far more organic multilateral education, especially in the early years of the education system.
And your point that it needs to be reversible is a very important point, Lehman. That's very important, right? In other words, it's not just, right, all ontology is phenomenology. That's exactly, you're right. That's exactly the reductive materialist move. But if it's obviously reversible. So, for example, Feuerbach says correctly, God's a figment of our imagination. God is a figment of our imagination, but our imagination is a figment of God. Right? In other words, if you don't make the reversible move, if you don't get that homo imaginus, then you get this actual intellectual absurdity, which becomes a moral absurdity. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about alienation from time. When I was thinking about this, I thought of two different aspects. One was, and Zach, you and I talked about Colin Wilson one time at Sky Meadow. Colin Wilson was a British neo-existentialist who studied the intentional production and cultural and evolutionary significance of peak experiences. And he had a sense that there was an additional faculty whereby a certain level of energy or a certain kind of intentionality, certain kinds of inner practices could put us in touch with a more visceral sense of past and future time, make it more real, make us more of a living participant in those times. On the other hand, there's a kind of like a naive developmental model that tracks, a dog has a 3-second awareness, and Mythic Kingdom people have a 6,000 year time span, and then science has a 14 billion year time span. And there's this notion of an increase of the ranges of past and futures that start to become cognitively and perhaps viscerally available to people. So I guess
Hmm.
the question is around, when we're looking at trying to get beyond our alienation of a fuller reality of time, is that alienation the result of not making some move that puts us into deep contact with the reality of time? Or are we already in good contact, but at a limited scale, and we have to grow beyond those scales?
Yeah, maybe I'll start this one. So we'll flip the order this time. Z Layman, if that works.
Sure.
So let's start with, because it's such a big deal. So this is just to be clear, right? Everyone, we're talking about this fourth expression of the global intimacy disorder, where I become intimate only with one of the three obviously available dimensions of time, either past or present or future. And I create one as the actual, right? The real, and I kind of ignore the other two. And so what we begin by saying in first principles and first values is that we have what we call first order and second order first principles and first values. And past, present, and future themselves are not coincidences of the manifest world, but they're values of cosmos. Right? There's past, there's present, and future. And the ability to access all three creates a fundamental wholeness, a fundamental intimacy with reality, a fundamental eros. And if I actually if I create an idolatry of one of them, if I create this kind of temporal myopic view in which I'm only in the past, kind of ancestor worship, right? Or, I'm only in the present, a kind of, radical, let's write a book. I don't know, let's call it, I don't know, Be Here Now, the power of the now, right? And that's whatever we want to call it, but which is very true. But I actually create this idolatry of the present, or I have the sense of avant-garde. It's all about to happen tomorrow, right? It's right. And so what we do is we try and articulate this notion, and it's very, very critical, right? And it's very beautiful, of what we call the three selves, right? And you've got this first self, which is the psychological self. And the psychological self embraces the past. And really, psychology's move was this actually liberation of the power of the past. In other words, religion did the ancestor past thing, and psychology actually was making the same move, but it moves it, right, from the mythic. It psychologizes the myth and says it's not the ancient ancestor myth, right? It's actually your own personal myth in a very important and beautiful way. So Freud says, with Breuer, those women aren't crazy. They've been abused, right? Those women in Vienna who are suffering from hysteria, right? They're not actually insane, and they're not actually fundamental violators of society as they were understood to be. No, they were abused. Let's go back into the past and let's find a key, and let's actually use the past, right, as a place from which I can liberate, right? And the entire move of trauma today, right, is based on this realization that the past, right, holds gifts. So religion in its way and psychology in its way hold to, right, these wondrous gifts of the past. The problem is they create this non-intimate relationship with the present, right? And so the psychologist, you would go to an ashram, that's a problem, right? And that's what are you doing that for? Because the ashram, right, is in some sense, whether you call it an ashram or whatever you want to call it, but it's the sense of, I don't know, it's the present, right? So when people went, for example, to Muktananda, right, when he came to America, right, let's say in the mid 70s, brought over by Rudy and Werner Erhard, and they kind of launched this incredible entry into, the eternity that resides in the present, which is the locus of mystical practice. And people would come to Muktananda, and say, Dick Mann, Richard Mann, who was a dear friend, who was the editor of the Transpersonal, soon he came with his kids who were sick with very deep, and he wrote about this, a very deep, kind of structural psychological sickness. And there was this sense, no, you're in the present. You don't need, all those other approaches, and with tragic results. Right. So there was this kind of rejection of the past and this idolatry of the present. And so, and again, clearly both of the interior sciences realize the eternity that resides in the present, right? But they actually reject the past, right? And so you have this kind of this, and then you have the kind of evolutionary view, which actually says, no, it's all about the future, right? And the present, right? And the past actually, right, don't really have a place. And the evolutionary view is critical because actually it says we're responsible to the future. And it's hard to know, it's hard to relate to people who are in a different geographic part of the world. It's certainly hard to relate to people who haven't been born yet. And yet the evolutionary view says, no, Homo Mors says, no, actually we're responsible to the unborn. We're responsible to the future. And in fact, the name of God, right, in the lineage of Solomon is a Yud, right, a Y, which is the future, right? And then Hey Vav Hey, which is the present. So it's an impossible conjugation, the name of God, of the future and the present is the name of God, right? And so what we're saying is that actually in my life, I have to have an intimate relationship, right? Both in my personal life and in my political life, in our economic life, right? In our global structure. The global intimacy disorder is based on, right, a distortion of our relationship to either the past, the present, or the future. And it's only when I actually realize that the litmus test for wholeness, right, is a full relationship between my psychological self, my mystical self, and my future self, right? And each one of those is critical, and you can't even, and with this, I'll turn to Z. For example, you can't do science without past, present, and future. And if you do science based on antecedent causation, and you don't actually have a sense of science being that which is describing, right, a causation that's also coming from the future. And I've spent many hours talking to Howard Bloom about this exact point, right? Looking at different structures in science, you can't even begin to think of reality as being only moved from the past. And the simplest way to say it is called emergence, right? Emergence means something emerges that's not merely emergent from the past, but is actually called by some depth of the present and the future. So that just begins this conversation, actually sets the stage. And again, the key is it's an intimacy issue, right? It's a right. And without that, right, maybe last example is Zach, we were talking before about there's no redemption. Just think about that for a second. So let's say you did something wrong. Right now, very few people have had an experience in which they are without having done something wrong. You did something wrong. And let's say you have no way to access the past, right? Which can, in the present, which has the capacity to change the future. You're devastated because there's no repair. There's no redemption, right? So for example, one of the structures of interior sciences is a capacity in the present to enter the depth of the present from which I can access the past and change the future, right? In other words, so the intimacy between the three is the basis of a structure called teshuvah, which is return or transformation, or a bad English translation, repentance. But what it means is not that I've covered up the past, but I can access the past. The past has a redemptive quality because the past lives in the present and redefines the future. That's just but one example. Okay, so I hope we laid out the beginning of this a little. Yeah.
Let's see here. I think I'll take it in a completely other direction. So like we get the 60-second minute and the 60-minute hour and the 24-hour day and the 7-day week from the ancient Babylonians. Just so you know. And the first large-scale technologies that were built were technologies to turn phenomenological time into objective time. So like Stonehenge, it's just an enormous sundial. I mean, it's much, much more than that, but it is in part a way to turn phenomenological time into objective time. And so that objective time, when we first started to mess around with it, was cosmologically ingrained objective time, meaning the lunar calendar, which is weird. The lunar calendar is different than our calendar. And so there's this long history which we inherited in a very concrete way of measuring time and turning the phenomenological flow of time into an objective artifact, and then regulating our biorhythms and habits of our entire daily routines and monthly routines and yearly harvest seasons and festival seasons, and all of that got lined up. And then there was a particular time when the Christians were like, you know what? Fuck all those lunar calendars. Right? And the Christians decided to put in place a fundamentally different kind of calendar. Now, we still had the 7-day week, and we still had something like the 13 months that came from the lunar calendar, but we didn't. Right? And we slightly displaced the festivals off of the actual cosmocentric objective time that we had discovered. Right? So Christmas is not on the winter solstice. Right? Easter is not on the spring solstice. Everything gets weird because we displaced even our measures of objective time from the actual objective time of the universe. So there's a very real way in which we are alienated both from our phenomenological time, and then we are alienated from the actual objective time of the universe, which we had been tracking, which then, as part of a massive psyop against the pagans, we displace the entire notion of what the calendrical record keeping was like. And that has had very, very, very profound implications on our psyches and our sense of being at home in the universe, and even knowing what time it actually is. Meaning, like, when are we? Right? So the ancient calendrical systems, which were aligned with the actual astrological nature of the stars and the rotation of the earth and these things, right? They had these long, like the Platonic year, right? They had these very long senses of where are we, right? When are we? And where we are, but in a more real sense, where we are in this huge arc of cosmological time, which we've been able to track. And we don't do that anymore. Time became a completely indiscriminate dimensionality without any qualitative nature within it, right? So it became a continuum, a completely discrete mathematical continuum with no qualitative differentiations in the kind of time. Meaning, like, when are we? Are we in a festival time? Are we in a time between worlds? Are we in the given time, right? Or are we in a special time, kairotic time? So this is another way in to say, yes, there's these alienation between the three types of selves which relate to the different types of time phenomenologically. But then there is this very deep hacking that occurred, which was a kind of psychological operation that separated humanity from the cosmic cycle of time. And so this is what's so interesting about those traditions that keep their actual lunar calendars, like the Hebrew wisdom tradition, which is like, okay, that's great. That's what year you guys think it is, but that's not what year it actually is. And you think you just have it on December 25th every year. It's like, why are you doing it on December 25th every year when the actual world would make it so that the holidays shift depending on when the moon is, right? Depending on where the actual sun is. And so that way of thinking about how we relate to the cosmos in terms of time, and organize our rituals and festivals around this actual time, we've lost that. And so there's a very real longing for a much more, I would say, what's the right word? Well, I'll just return to the metaphor of being at home, like knowing when we are. We don't know when we are. And that is by design, I would say.
You know, we talk about in cosmologic humanism these three questions. We talk about where the three great questions of cosmologic humanism: where are you, right? Who are you, and what ought I do? And we've deliberately avoided why, which is a theological question. But actually, the question of when, right, is actually an enormously, important question. When am I? And this notion of, and let's just maybe just stay in this for one more moment, right? This notion of time, right, and the displacement of the holiday, because the holiday is a holy day.
Yes.
Right? What a holiday means is that time is not merely a measurable, quantifiable, linear structure, but time is actually a quality. And in that sense, it has there's a linear structure. It's also a cyclical structure. It's a cyclical structure. There's this eternal return. Teshuvah, this notion of return, repentance we talked about, means you can come back to this quality of time, which in the intimate universe is occasioned by the reconfiguration of, right, if I can borrow from Whitehead in a different way, of the occurrence, right? In other words, when the occurrence reconfigures itself, I re-enter into that space.
Right. So it's it's this question of value. It's like, is today a holy day? Is today a holy day because we say it is? And you guys say this other day is holy, and that's cool. And there actually isn't a holy day. We just make up when there is a holy day. Whereas we're saying, actually, no, the solstice is a holy day. Like, it's the only day.
It actually is a holy day, right?
Right. Yeah.
And that's exactly right. And that is intimacy. And this is a different conversation, this little segue. But what's the relationship between the sacred and between value? It's a very, very important question. And they're not the same. They're not actually reducible to each other, but they are overlapping. So, and I will spare you the exegetical, kind of play now. But let me just say this with some authority, right? Because I've done the exercise. If you go through the kind of 70 or 80 texts that deal with this, but you actually realize that value is not as Otto, suggested in the idea of the holy. It's not the other. It's not the numinous that's transcendent. Right, but actually, the sacred is the radically intimate. Right, it's the sense of radical. Right, the sacred is this radical sense of intimacy. Karova Adonai l'nishbarei lev. Right, the sense of this. The infinite is what we call in cosmologic humanism. We say that the name of God is the infinite intimate. Right, the sacred. Right, the sacred name is the infinite intimate, and the infinite intimate is intimate with the quality of time. Right, I mean. Because each quality of time, just like there's a unique self of person, because the person is a sacred incarnation of value, there's a unique self of time, right? Time actually has a unique quality, which is not a materialistic construction, right? Which is why the actual word time, Zman, means invitation, because actually there are no extra days. Just like there's no extra people, there's no extra days. And that actually the notion of a day is an invitation. The day seeks to love me open, if you will, but in an erotic sense. It's to love me open, right? And I, in my irreducible uniqueness, seek to love the moment open. And so when I'm loved open by the moment, and the moment loves me open, right? Then the pregnancy of the moment births an emergence, right? And in some real sense, if you want to really read Whitehead carefully, that's what he's describing. He's describing about an occurrence which receives all of the past and thrusts into the future, right? And that is and that's what emergence is. Emergence is not measured by mechanical time. Emergence means that time, right, is part of the creative process. And one of the ways you can see this is just so in this crazy, beautiful way is the very notion of Sabbath, right? Sabbath, which is not a space, it's a palace in time, right? In which you enter and it can't be destroyed. And so when when I was in Dharamsala and in this strange conversation of a different time and not the time to tell that story, but with, Mr. Dalai Lama, and we were having a good time, right, in Dharamsala, and he wanted to understand how did the lineage of Solomon survive exile. And he said, we're not doing well here in Dharamsala. And obviously Tibet is wrecked. And he said, it was funny. He said, haha, the way he talks, haha. He says, I go to the West because they like me there. They're very nice to me. Here in Dharamsala in Tibet, I'm quite unpopular. So in one word, it's because of Sabbath, right? This notion I can enter into a palace in time quite literally, not as a psychological construct, but as actual something that's real. And so time has past and it has present and it has future. these are these three qualities of time, and time is, right, Zach, as you were just pointing towards, it is the reduction of time to a materialist construct, right, is tragic. Time is so much more subtle than that, and it is. I don't want to go into bad physics, which is a very bad idea. Always go into bad physics, but without going, let's just be in good physics for a second. If you've read the last 4 or 5 years, I must have read 3, 4 quite good articles at the center of physics about the collapse of the space-time continuum, right? The way we understand it in its purely measurable form, right, as a sufficient, right, explanation of reality. And that's precisely what this notion of teshuvah is. It's why Cook, right, talks about this notion of scattering the boundaries of time and existing in relationship to past, present, and future. So that's what we're talking about here, this intimacy with time. And if you're not intimate with time, we come back to, right, where we started, alienation. It's kind of very deep alienation. Yeah.
Feels like there's a lot here in this time question. I remembered for a second an experience I had as a kid when I saw a picture of, you guys remember that ear that they grew on the back of a rat? I remember seeing that in a science magazine, and I thought, oh, this is going to be normalized, and I don't want to miss this moment. I want to do something to remind myself that this is where I am in history. And it's very easy to lose track of where we are as things continue to change. It requires some additional effort to try to figure out what moment we're actually in. I like all this stuff about um, making sure we're not alienated from the three times and that they're not alienated from each other, and that our self of memory and our self of forethought and our self of sensing are all included. It's very interesting to think about being alienated both from phenomenological and ontological time. And there's an interesting thing in the way that kind of the way the Christian fundamentalist timescape is presented as this sort of chunk of the world was created, the book was written, and then the apocalypse will come. It takes several thousand years. And that's the entire system. When you compare that to other ancient mythic systems where there's many cycles of that, and they break the alienation from the sense that there's a deep continuity of these cycles might come about in part through this alienation of the distorted ontological calendar process. That intrigues me. A lot of other things came up for me there too. Like I wonder about how seldom we look at the night sky, right? And now it's physically occluded in many respects, but we become then alienated from the calendrical potential of seeing the heavens move that our ancestors constantly had vivid exposure to. I'm curious about the notion of the eternal recurrence, or maybe I would say like indefinite extension. There's some kind of experience you have in ritual and sacred performance where you feel like what you're doing echoes into eternity. And there's a certain kind of intimacy there, as if each of these gestures is echoing forever, that if we don't get that kind of experience of time, something is fundamentally missing. The other thing, yeah.
Just to be precise and potent for a second, we don't want to, in cosmologic humanism, identify only with circular time, with the myth of eternal return, and to kind of demonize, right, linear time, right? No, linear time has validity, right? Right. We're talking about commodified time, time that's only measurable, but actually there are two notions. We might call them, line time and circle time, if you will, but both of those are valid. Both Chronos time and Kairos time are valid. Both line time and circle time are valid. And it's what line time is saying is this notion of history, right? That actually, the field of value operates in history, right? And that time is related to story, right? Even as it's beyond story. So when time stands still, the story stops. And yet, right, I actually live the calendar. Right. Actually, right. The grand master of one of the disciples of the Baal Shem Tov, Shneur Zalman of La'adi, right. His the seventh master in that lineage, would always say in Yiddish, he would say, "Live the calendar." right? And what he meant was live time. So we want to live in both of those. We don't want to demonize circle time, right? Which is what Zach was describing, the demonization, right, of circle time, this kind of, and the adoption of only a surface version of linear time. And at the same time, we don't want to make the Eliade mistake, which Campbell also makes, right? Which is this kind of, it's the myth of eternal return. And actually linear time is somehow a violation, right? We need this line and circle, which is a larger conversation, right? And we need to not have a non-intimacy between line and circle. We need the forms of time, just like the forms of knowing, to be intimate with each other. Just to kind of clarify that tenderly.
Yeah, our friend Alexander Bard has done a lot of work on circular and linear time, particularly in his last
Really, I didn't know
book.
that. Beautiful.
And one of the reasons I want to say something like indefinite extension rather than eternal recurrence is because I don't mean the endless cycle of the same. I mean a way of participating where it seems as if there is indefinite echoes of one's action through time, and that's a ritual state that the community has to have regular access to in order to not be alienated from a particular quality that time has to offer.
Beautiful. 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 We've gotten through 4, right? That's pretty good.
We're not too far from halfway, so let's bring it to an end. Let's call this part 1 of part 2.
Wonderful. What a great time it was.
That's right. It was a great time. It is a great time, and now it's time for us to bring it to an end. Thanks very much, guys. I appreciate not only your work and your intellectual acumen, but the exuberance you bring to these topics.
Thank you. Delighted.
Always a pleasure.
Cheers. Cheers, guys. Be well.
Later.